So next we'll be calling on William Masters to talk about the impacts of agricultural production, trade, and the food system on global nutrient inequalities and implications for nutrient interventions.
Thank you, Daniel. So keeping on the theme of global studies before we turn to the individual country cases, I'm presenting on behalf of the first author for this particular study, Keith Lividini, and also Winnie Bell, who are doctoral students doing their dissertations on this topic that was inspired by conversations with Alan Dangor, with Sunita Kadiala, and with Bhavani Shankar about this question of nutritional inequality. And could we come up with a fresh way of thinking about global equity with support from Keith's work in Harvest Plus and A4NH, and a little bit of support from the Wellcome Trust to think about, could we address nutritional inequality on a global scale in a novel way, which I hope you'll agree is quite a dramatically important question, because nutritional deficiencies, to the extent that they have been measured, appear to be quite specific in their locations, but they've been measured with fairly limited individual survey data, and typically averages and aggregate indicators such as stunting, here the hidden hunger index aggregating a number of different dimensions at once. So we want to unpack that into individual nutrients and the specific strategies that Harvest Plus, the A4NH system in the CGIAR, program in CGIAR, and individual activities that you might be involved in could address specific issues. And this study begins with the question of international trade. And the reason why that's so important is because trade is often restricted by national governments. So those of us who came for this conference internationally went through a set of hoops to obtain a visa. The same is true of food products. The shipment would need to be accompanied by certificates paying import tariffs, taxes, comply with quotas, and often exports are often restricted as well. That's been a subject of research for me throughout my career, and what I was able to show in a study of Africa with Kim Anderson in the World Bank, part of a big effort in the early 2000s, many African governments sharply lowered their taxes on their farmers when they were trying to export, and reduced barriers to food imports during the 1980s and 90s. But after the 2008 financial crisis and food crisis, and particularly after 2016, there's a remarkable wave of nationalism that's raising trade barriers. And these are choices that government makes that respond to lobbying, respond to advocacy, and crucially, we could potentially do something about. Previous work on trade focuses on food security, on income, and so we're asking about micronutrients, specific nutrient by nutrient analysis of how trade interacts with production to influence availability. So we're taking a social ecological approach in which the question of interest, health outcomes, depends on nutrient availability, each individual nutrient that a person might need, depends on production, perhaps also depends on trade, and that in turn is embedded in this larger context of agroecological conditions and demographic structure. Our specific sociological mechanism, the socio-ecological mechanism under which trade might matter, comes from an understanding of the world in which on the ocean there are ships full of agricultural commodities that are roughly the same price anywhere in the world, because ocean shipping is not very expensive. But some countries enter that world food system exporting on the left. Some countries are more or less self-sufficient, for example, a lot of Central Africa, very far from the oceans, and some countries are importing, as you would see here. So roughly the same price in trade and different country stances relative to the rest of the world. So what do we do about this? Well, we convert food balance sheets into nutrient balance sheets. As you might know, a food balance sheet is an effort to estimate consumption by subtraction. Since we don't observe intake directly, we take government estimates of production, subtract imports, add imports, subtract exports, and non-food uses, including waste, and that gives you the net what's left over. And we do that for nutrients, nutrient by nutrient in the foods. We then, crucially, add in the demographic composition of the country to get nutrient requirements. based on the fraction of the population that's children, adults, elderly, male and female, and so forth. And what that gives us is this long-term change in nutrient by nutrient availability that might come from production within a country, that might come from trade, exports or imports, and after subtracting waste, be compared to the requirements of that given population. So our focus is national totals. We understand fully well that any individual household's intake depends on the distribution, but if you're a country with very low supplies in total of, say, vitamin A, no matter how that's distributed, it's very hard to meet requirements. Similarly, the national totals data are quite limited, and what we're trying to do here is to use what's available as best we can, and then shine a light on those data and try to improve their quality. You might not appreciate the degree to which agricultural production relative to nutrient needs is extremely unequal around the world. From 1961, the beginning of these nutrient balance sheets that we have, this is now in total calories, production minus requirements of the population, extremely patchy, with enormous surpluses in some countries and deficits in other countries. When you look at food availability, it's become more equally distributed around the world. The reason, of course, is trade. The regions that have advanced science and technology for agriculture, abundant infrastructure for irrigation, rural transport, electrification, they are blowing out the grain, blowing out the livestock feed that the rest of the world then imports, including, crucially, Africa, increasing its imports quite dramatically. And our task in this project is to zoom in nutrient by nutrient. So what you see is the landscape here in these maps for vitamin A, for example. And I'll contrast vitamin A to some other examples. You can't really think about inequality with a map. It's just you can't understand, is this more equal or less equal? In order to think about equality, economists have developed this technique, this visualization tool. So here you see a specific country, in this case China, and what this type of diagram does, a Lorenz curve, is array all the population of the world along the x-axis in terms of their level of this thing, vitamin A in this case, and the fraction of all vitamin A that they have. So if vitamin A were equally distributed among all countries, this would be a diagonal line, and this area A is the degree of inequality as a fraction of this whole area is called a Gini coefficient. We color code and we show individual countries in that way. So the contrast between vitamin A and another nutrient is very dramatic in this example. Contrasting vitamin A, as you notice, little change from 1970 to 2010 in inequality. Vitamin B12, which you may know is primarily from animal source foods, extremely much more unequal back in 1970 and becomes more equally distributed by 2010 to the point where it's roughly the same level of inequality as vitamin A. What you notice for the case of vitamin A, when we do this nutrient balance sheet over time, is that you see the inequality. Remember, a larger number is more unequal, more inequitably distributed around the world. Production of vitamin A became more unequal starting in the early 1990s, as all the dietary sources of vitamin A in their production became increasingly concentrated in the countries whose agricultural systems focused on production of fruits and vegetables and so forth. And the gap between these two, the light green line is availability, became wider. By what magic? The magic of trade. So the inequality in agriculture was much less than the inequality in consumption or availability in the national total. Of course, we don't know how this was distributed within a country, but we do know that the availability was kept more equal than production by trade. B12, in contrast, had this remarkable trajectory over time. So what's the bottom line here? Results for all nutrients, nutrient by nutrient, the macro and then 18 micronutrients, reveal that in general, trade has helped equalize access to each individual nutrient. For example, the B12 story and the vitamin A story. Trade policies could be much better. There are still extreme restrictions on a number of nutritionally important food products around the world that are every bit as restrictive as the difficulties in obtaining visas that many of us experienced coming here. So we're really happy to be here, thanks to visa services. But nutrient gaps are often not fillable by trade because trade may be impossible, trade may be too costly, and so there's an opportunity to use this technique to identify specific nutrients for whom you would need other sorts of techniques and use nutrient balance sheets to guide micronutrient policy through the various instruments available to agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will.